In the grey dawn of a shattered realm, 5 kings rose to claim a single throne. This is the saga of Robb Stark, the young wolf. He broke the wrong oath for true love and rode on unaware, straight toward a feast where music would turn to murder. This is the Red Wedding, one night of treachery that changed the North forever. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy the stories I tell here. I love hearing from you. Drop a comment below with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this community connecting from all across the world. Chapter 1. The Throne in Flames. In the grey emptiness of dawn, the riverlands stretched beneath a sky the colour of old steel, its villages reduced to blackened skeletons, and its fields trampled into mud. On a low hill overlooking the Green Fork, Robb Stark sat astride his grey destrier, one hand resting lightly on the pommel of his sword, while the other held the reins with the easy confidence of a young man who had spent his life in the saddle. The bronze circlet that served as his crown caught what little sunlight broke through the clouds, a simple thing compared to the jeweled monstrosities worn by southern kings, but no less significant for its plainness. Beside him, Grey Wind paced with restless energy, the great dire wolf's amber eyes scanning the landscape with an intelligence that sometimes unsettled even those who rode with his master. The death of his father had been the spark that ignited everything, though Robb understood now that the kindling had been laid long before Lord Eddard's head fell beneath King Joffrey's executioner. The realm had been fracturing for years, held together by little more than the force of King Robert's personality and the weight of Lannister gold. When Robert died, whether by boar or by poison, the Robb would never truly know that fragile unity had shattered like glass dropped on stone. How many kings now claimed the Iron Throne? Robb had lost count in the chaos of the war, though his mother reminded him often enough. Joffrey in King's Landing, a cruel boy with his mother's vindictiveness, and none of his supposed father's strength. Stannis on Dragonstone, rigid as the iron he was named for, convinced of his rightful claim. Renly in Highgarden, playing at kingship with the Tyrell roses to prop up his pretty crown. Balon Greyjoy had crowned himself again in the Iron Islands, that bitter old reaver, who had bent the knee once and clearly resented every moment of it. And himself, Robb Stark, the king in the north, crowned not in a sept or a throne room, but in a war pavilion, with the voices of his bannermen echoing off canvas walls as they named him their king. The title still felt strange to him, even after months of wearing the crown. He had been raised to be a lord, to serve the king and protect the north, not to be king himself. But his father's execution had changed everything, transforming him from Lord Eddard's heir into something else entirely. The king in the north, the young wolf, names that carried weight he was still learning to bear. Behind him, the camp was stirring to life as dawn fully broke. Fires were being kindled, their smoke rising in thin grey columns to merge with the morning mist. Men moved between tents with the purposeful efficiency of a host that had been on campaign long enough to know their duties without being told. The clatter of pots mixed with the sharper sounds of armor being donned and weapons being checked. A horse nickered somewhere in the distance, answered by another closer. At hand, Robb breathed deeply, drawing in the smells of the camp. Wood smoke and cooking porridge, leather and steel. the earthy scent of thousands of men living in close quarters. These were northern men, mostly, though they had been joined by river lords whose lands had suffered under Lannister occupation. Mallister, Blackwood, Bracken, each with their own grievances against the Lions of Casterly Rock. The northern host had swollen with each victory, drawing to it those who saw in Robb's early triumphs the hope of something better than Lannister rule. Those victories had come swiftly at first, faster than Robb had dared hope. The Whispering Wood, where they had caught Sir Jaime Lannister's forces in a trap as neat as any his father might have planned. Robb could still remember the confusion on the Lannister scouts' faces as northern soldiers emerged from the trees, the panicked shouts as they realized they had ridden into an ambush. And then Jaime himself, the Kingslayer, golden and arrogant even in defeat, sitting in chains and radiating contempt for his captors. Oxcross had followed, a night raid on Stafford Lannister's supply camp that had put 1,000 men to the sword and left the Lannister army in the west scrambling for provisions. Lord Stark's men had been particularly brutal in that fight, Robb recalled, their hatred of the Lannisters burning hot after Jaime had killed 2 of Lord Rickard's sons during his escape attempt. The memory of that night was a confusion of fire and screaming, of grey wind tearing out the throat of a fleeing knight, of his own sword red to the hilt by the time dawn came. Each victory had brought more men to his banners, but Robb was beginning to understand what his father had tried to teach him about the nature of command. Victory united men, but the bonds between them could fray quickly when fortunes turned. He could see it already in the way certain lords watched each other across campfires, the way old grudges simmered beneath the surface of their oaths to him. The Brackens and Blackwoods had hated each other for centuries. That feud was so old that no one could quite remember how it started. The Karstarks grew more bitter with each passing day, nursing their grief and rage. And Roose Bolton. Robb's jaw tightened at the thought of Lord Bolton. There was something about the man that made the young king uneasy, though he could never quite articulate what it was. Bolton was competent, his men were well disciplined, and his counsel was often sound. Yet there was a coldness to him, a quality of watching and calculating that reminded Robb of a lizard sunning itself on a rock, perfectly still but alert to any opportunity. When Bolton looked at him, Robb sometimes felt as though he were being evaluated, measured for worth in ways that had nothing to do with honor or loyalty. A footstep behind him drew Robb from his thoughts. He turned to find his mother approaching, her auburn hair touched with threads of silver that caught the morning light. Lady Catelyn's face bore the lines of worry that had deepened since Ned's death, but her back was straight and her eyes were clear. She had insisted on accompanying him on this campaign, despite his protests, and Robb had to admit, if only to himself, that her counsel had proven valuable more than once. "The men are ready to march," she said quietly, coming to stand beside his horse. Her hand reached up to touch his stirrup, a gesture that reminded him suddenly of his childhood when he had been a boy learning to ride, and she had steadied him just so. "Lord Umber is eager to push south. He thinks we should strike for Harrenhal, while Tywin is still consolidating his forces there." Robb nodded slowly, turning his gaze back to the landscape spread before them. Harrenhal, that cursed ruin of melted stone and dark legends, Tywin Lannister had taken it as his seat of operations in the Riverlands, and from there he coordinated the movements of his vast host. To strike at Harrenhal would be to strike at the heart of Lannister power in the region, but it would also be to attack one of the most formidable fortifications in the Seven Kingdoms, even in its ruined state. "The Great John means well," Robb said finally, his voice carrying that measured quality he had learned to adopt when speaking as king, rather than as a young man barely past his 16th name-day. "But Harrenhal is a trap. We'd be besieging a castle that can withstand any assault, while Tywin's army grows stronger inside it. We need to keep moving, keep striking where he doesn't expect us." Catelyn was quiet for a moment, her eyes following the direction of his gaze. "What news from the twins?" she asked, and Robb felt a familiar tension settle in his shoulders at the question. The phrase, he had known from the beginning that he would need them. Their castle controlled the crossing of the Green Fork, and without that crossing his army's movements were severely limited. Lord Walder Frey, that ancient, bitter man with his vast brood of children and grandchildren, had driven a hard bargain for his allegiance. A marriage alliance, Robb to wed one of his daughters or granddaughters in exchange for the Frey host and the use of the twins. Robb had agreed because he had no choice. Not then. Not with his army needing to move quickly, and the crossing being essential to their plans. He had given his oath, spoken the words that bound him to the agreement, and Lord Walder had opened his bridge. The Frey soldiers had joined his host, thousands of them, and together they had struck at the Lannisters with devastating effect. But now, "No new messages," Robb said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. He could feel his mother's eyes on him, sharp with the knowledge of what he wasn't saying. The question of his marriage hung between them like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full extent of the camp below. 30,000 men, perhaps more, all looking to him for leadership, for victory, for the justice they believed he could deliver. The weight of their expectations pressed down on Robb's shoulders, as surely as the bronze crown pressed against his temples. Grey wind rumbled deep in his throat, a sound that was half growl, half whine. The direwolf sensed his mood, as he always did. Robb reached down to touch the wolf's massive head, feeling the coarse fur beneath his fingers and the warmth of the living creature. His father had always said that the direwolves were gifts from the old gods, and in moments like these, Robb believed it. Grey Wind's presence was a comfort, a reminder of home and simpler times, even as everything else grew more complicated with each passing day. "We should return to camp," Catelyn said softly. "The lords will be gathering for the war council, and they'll want to know our next move." Robb nodded, gathering his reins. As he turned his horse back toward the camp, his eyes swept once more across the horizon, where storm clouds were gathering in the distance. The realm was burning, kingdoms rising and falling, like the smoke from 1,000 fires. And somewhere to the south, in the great castle called the Twins, Lord Walder Frey sat on his bridge and waited for something Robb couldn't quite name, but that filled him with a dread he couldn't entirely dismiss. The young wolf rode down the hill toward his waiting army, while above him the grey sky pressed down like a lid on a pot about to boil over. Chapter 2. The King of the North's Promise. The war pavilion was thick with the smell of men who had been campaigning for months, a mix of sweat-dampened wool, leather that had absorbed too much rain, and the sharp metallic scent of oiled steel. Lanterns hung from the support poles cast pools of yellow light across the rough wooden table where maps were spread, their edges weighted down with daggers and drinking cups. The maps themselves were creased and worn from constant handling, their ink smudged in places where fingers had traced routes and possibilities. Robb stood at the head of the table, his hands braced against its surface, studying the network of rivers and roads that represented both opportunity and obstacle. His commanders surrounded him in a loose circle, each man carrying the weight of his own concerns and ambitions. The great Yon Umber loomed largest among them, a bear of a man whose voice seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. Beside him stood Lord Stark, grey-bearded and grim, his grief over his son's deaths having hardened into something cold and implacable. And there, slightly apart from the others, as he always was, stood Rose Bolton, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like still water. The plan Robb had laid before them was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, but caution had never won wars. They would split their forces, using the superior mobility of their cavalry to strike at multiple Lannister positions simultaneously, keeping Tywin off balance and unable to concentrate his larger army effectively. It was the kind of strategy that required perfect timing and a great deal of luck, but it was also the only way Robb could see to compensate for their disadvantage in numbers. The lords had debated the plan for hours, their voices rising and falling as they argued over details and contingencies. But eventually they had agreed, or at least consented to follow their king's lead. Now, as the council was breaking up, and men were filing out into the night to relay orders to their subordinates, Robb found himself thinking not about the military campaign, but about the promise he had made to secure it. Lord Walder Frey's price for the use of the twins had been steep, but straightforward. A marriage alliance, binding the northern kingdom to the Freys through blood. Robb had agreed without hesitation at the time, understanding that without the crossing, his army would be trapped on the wrong side of the Green Fork, unable to move with the speed their strategy required. He had given his oath before witnesses, promising to take a Frey bride when the time was right, to honor that alliance with marriage as well as with words. At the time, it had seemed a small price to pay. Robb had never met any of Walder Frey's daughters or granddaughters, had no particular attachment to anyone else, and understood that kings rarely married for love. His own parents' marriage had been arranged, yet they had found happiness together. Why should his be any different? But that had been before the crag, before the minor siege that had turned into something he hadn't anticipated. The crag was a small castle on the western coast, held by House Westerling, a family of ancient name but diminished fortune. They had declared for the Lannisters, whether out of conviction or necessity, Robb couldn't say, and his strategy had required neutralizing their position. The siege itself had been brief, more of a formality than a true military action. The Westerlings had little stomach for a prolonged defense, and had yielded after a token resistance. It was during the negotiations for their surrender that Robb had first seen Jane Westerling, and that sight had changed everything in ways he was still struggling to understand. She had been standing in the castle's great hall when he entered, the late afternoon sun streaming through the high windows, and catching in her dark hair. Her dress was simple, perhaps even slightly worn, speaking to her family's reduced circumstances, but she wore it with a dignity that caught his attention immediately. When she looked at him, her eyes held neither fear nor calculation, only a quiet sadness that seemed to echo something in his own heart. They had spoken that first day only briefly, the formal exchanges required by courtesy and the situation. But Robb had found himself thinking about her afterward, remembering the way she held herself, the quality of her voice, the fleeting expressions that crossed her face when she thought no one was watching. He told himself it was nothing, that he was simply struck by her beauty, as any young man might be. But when he visited the castle again the next day, ostensibly to finalize the terms of the Westerlings' submission, he knew he was lying to himself. The attraction between them had grown quickly, perhaps too quickly, nurtured by long conversations in the castle gardens, where summer roses still bloomed despite the lateness of the season. Jane spoke of her family's history, of the long, slow decline from glory into genteel poverty, with a frankness that Robb found refreshing after months of dealing with lords who measured every word for advantage. She asked him about the North, about Winterfell and his family, and when he spoke of his father's death, he saw genuine grief in her eyes, not the calculated sympathy he had grown accustomed to receiving. They had kissed for the first time beneath an oak tree older than either of their houses, its branches heavy with leaves that rustled in the evening breeze. The moment had felt both inevitable and surprising, a natural culmination of everything that had been building between them. Robb could still remember the softness of her lips, the way her hand had come up to touch his cheek, the rapid beating of his own heart as though he had just run a great distance. It was only later, lying awake in his tent while his army slept around him, that the full weight of what was happening had settled onto his shoulders. He had given his oath to marry a Frey, not a suggestion or a vague intention, but a sworn promise, the kind of promise his father had taught him was sacred. To break such an oath would be to dishonor not just himself, but his house, to prove himself no better than the Lannisters, who twisted words and broke promises whenever it suited them. Yet the thought of marrying someone else, some unknown Frey daughter he had never met and might never come to care for, felt suddenly impossible. What he felt for Jane was unlike anything he had experienced before, a connection that went beyond physical attraction or political convenience. When he was with her, the weight of his crown seemed to lift, and he could remember who he had been before the war, before his father's death, before everything had become so complicated and fraught with consequence. The internal struggle had consumed him for days. He paced the boundaries of the camp at night, grey wind padding silently beside him, while he wrestled with duty and desire. His mother's words echoed in his mind, the lessons about honor and responsibility that both his parents had instilled in him from childhood. A Stark keeps his promises. Those who break their oaths are no better than the Freys themselves, selling their loyalty to the highest bidder. But his father had also taught him that leadership sometimes meant making difficult choices, that clinging too rigidly to one principle could mean betraying another. And wasn't there honor in following his heart, in choosing genuine affection over cold political calculation? Wasn't that what made men different from the pieces on a chessboard, moved around by others for strategic advantage? The decision, when he finally made it, came not through careful reasoning, but in a moment of clarity that felt almost like relief. He loved Jane Westerling, and he would marry her. The consequences would have to be dealt with as they came, but he would not sacrifice his own happiness and hers for a promise made when he had not known such feelings were possible. His father might have chosen differently, might have counseled duty over desire, but his father was dead, and Robb was king, and kings made their own choices. The wedding had been small, conducted by a septon from a nearby village, with only a handful of witnesses present. Jane had worn a dress of cream-colored silk that her mother had saved from better days, and Robb had wrapped her in a cloak, bearing the Stark direwolf. He remembered the weight of the moment, the sound of her voice speaking the vows, the feeling of her hand in his, as they spoke the words that bound them together. Grey Wind had sat at the back of the sept, silent but watchful, and Robb had chosen to interpret that silence as approval. It was only afterward, in the days following the wedding, that the full magnitude of what he had done began to reveal itself. His bannermen's reactions had been varied and telling. The great Yon had laughed and clapped him on the back, declaring that a man should marry for love when he could. Lord Karstark had been grimmer, warning that the Freys would not take the slight lightly, but had ultimately accepted his king's decision. Others had been more circumspect, offering congratulations that felt hollow, their eyes calculating what this might mean for the alliances they had all been counting on. Rose Bolton had said very little, which somehow felt more ominous than if he had spoken volumes. The Pale Lord had simply nodded when informed of the marriage, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. But Robb had caught him watching afterward, those cold eyes assessing and measuring, and had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The letter to Lord Walder Frey had been the hardest thing Robb had ever had to write. He had labored over every word, trying to find a way to explain his actions that might soften the blow of his broken oath. He had offered other alliances in compensation, suggested matches between Frey daughters and northern lords, promised continued military cooperation and friendship between their houses. But even as he wrote these things, he knew they were inadequate. He had given his word and broken it, and no amount of apologetic explanation could change that fundamental fact. The response, when it came, had been brief and venomous. Lord Walder's words dripped with contempt and wounded pride, calling Robb an oath-breaker and worse. The Frey soldiers who had been marching with his host were recalled, several thousand men who turned their banners around and marched back toward the twins. The loss of their numbers was significant, but more troubling was the loss of their goodwill, the transformation of potential allies into certain enemies. Robb stood now in his tent, Jane sleeping peacefully in the bed behind him, while he stared at the maps and tried to calculate the cost of his choice. Outside, the camp was settling into its nightly routines, fires being banked and sentries being posted. The sounds were familiar and oddly comforting, but they could not quite dispel the growing unease in his chest. He had chosen love over duty, heart over honor, and he could not bring himself to regret it. But as he looked at the map showing the twins and the Green Fork crossing that he had once been promised and now was surely denied to him, He wondered what price he would ultimately pay for that choice. In a world where oaths were the bonds that held society together, where breaking one's word was considered the basest form of treachery, what did it mean that he, the king in the north, had proven his word could be set aside when it suited him? The answer, he feared, was something he would learn in time, and that the learning would be neither easy nor kind. Word. Chapter 3. The Twins and its Master. The great hall of the twins smelled of damp stone, and the accumulated breath of too many people living in too close quarters for too long. Lord Walder Frey sat in his high seat, a chair that had been carved from oak older than most of the kingdoms of Westeros, its arms worn smooth by generations of Frey hands. The wood was dark with age and oil, and when Walder gripped it, as he did now, he could feel every groove and imperfection, each one a reminder of the long line of lords who had sat here before him, guarding the crossing that was both their greatest asset and their entire reason for existing. He was old now, so old that sometimes he forgot exactly how many name days he had seen, though he thought it was somewhere past 90. His body had become a collection of aches and pains, joints that protested every movement, skin like parchment stretched over bones that felt increasingly brittle. But his mind remained sharp, perhaps sharper than it had ever been, honed by decades of navigating the treacherous currents of Westerosi politics, while other, greater houses rose and fell around him. Through the tall windows of the hall, Walder could see the Green Fork flowing past, its waters dark and swift with the autumn rains. The river was everything to the Freys, the source of their power and the foundation of their fortune. Two castles, identical twins connected by a bridge, controlled the only reliable crossing for hundreds of miles in either direction. Anyone wanting to move an army north or south through the riverlands had to pass through the twins, had to seek permission from the Freys, had to acknowledge, however grudgingly, that this relatively minor house held a position of strategic importance far beyond what their bloodline or their wealth might otherwise warrant. It was a lesson Walder had learned early and never forgotten. In a world where great houses like the Starks and Lannisters commanded loyalty through ancient lineage and vast resources, the Freys survived through geography and careful calculation. They were not loved, that much was certain. The other river lords looked down on them as upstarts and toll collectors, newcomers who had gained their position through commerce rather than conquest. But they were necessary, and necessity, Walder had long ago concluded, was worth more than affection. The sound of footsteps on stone drew his attention to the doorway, where his eldest son, Steveron, was entering the hall. Steveron was past 60 himself, grey-haired and increasingly stooped, waiting patiently for his father to die so that he could finally become lord in his own right. Walder felt a surge of contempt looking at him. The boy, and he still thought of him as a boy, despite his age, lacked the ruthlessness needed to maintain the family's position. He was too concerned with honor and what the other lords thought of them, too eager to be accepted by houses that would never truly respect the Freys, no matter how much they bowed and scraped. "Father," Steveron said, his voice carrying the careful tone he always used when bringing news he knew would be unwelcome. "Another raven has arrived from the young wolf's camp." Walder's fingers tightened on the armrests of his chair. The young wolf, Robb Stark, the boy who had come to him months ago with his army at his back, and his need for the crossing written plainly on his face. Walder had known immediately that he held the advantage in that negotiation, had seen the desperation beneath the Northern King's proud bearing. The Starks needed the twins, and they needed it quickly, before Tywin Lannister could consolidate his position and trap them on the wrong side of the river. So Walder had named his price, a marriage alliance between House Stark and House Frey. The king in the north would marry one of Walder's daughters or granddaughters. There were plenty to choose from after all, and in return the Freys would provide passage and add their soldiers to his host. It was a fair bargain, more than fair, really, elevating House Frey to unprecedented heights by binding them to royal blood. Robb Stark had agreed, had given his oath before witnesses, and Walder had opened his bridge. But now, Walder thought bitterly, now the boy had broken that oath as casually as if it meant nothing. "What does it say?" he asked, though he already knew. More apologies, more promises of other alliances that didn't involve a royal marriage, more carefully worded explanations that boiled down to a simple truth. Robb Stark had married for love and considered his promise to the Freys to be expendable. Steveron cleared his throat, unfolding the message with hands that trembled slightly. "He offers to match his uncle, Edmure Tully, with one of our daughters, and suggests marriages between several of our other children and northern houses. He emphasizes his continued friendship and alliance, and hopes we will understand his position." "Understand his position," Walder repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. "The boy breaks his oath and expects us to understand. He takes a bride from a family of no importance, some minor house barely able to feed itself, and thinks we should be content with his leavings." The insult of it burned in Walder's chest like acid. It wasn't just about the broken promise, though that was bad enough. It was about what the breaking represented, the casual disregard with which the great houses treated those they considered beneath them. The Starks, with their honor and their noble pretensions, had proven themselves no different from any other house when it suited them. They would use the Freys when needed, and discard them when convenient, and expect gratitude for whatever scraps they chose to toss down afterward. Around the hall, other Freys had begun to gather, drawn by the sound of raised voices. His sons and grandsons, his daughters and their husbands, the vast sprawling network of family that was both House Frey's strength and its greatest source of internal conflict. Walder could see the anger on many of their faces, particularly among the younger men who had marched with the young wolf and now felt themselves shamed by his actions. Black Walder Rivers, one of his bastard grandsons, stepped forward, his face flushed with fury. "We should withdraw our support immediately," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Call our men back and let the young wolf see how far his honor carries him without the crossing." Others murmured agreement, but Walder raised a hand for silence. His mind was already working, calculating the angles and possibilities that the situation presented. Yes, they could withdraw their support, recall their soldiers, and close the bridge to Stark forces. It would be satisfying, certainly, to watch the Northern King's position deteriorate without their aid. But satisfaction, Walder had learned long ago, was a poor substitute for advantage. The war was far from over, and the question now was not how to respond to the insult, but how to position House Frey to survive and prosper regardless of which king eventually emerged victorious. The Starks had shown themselves to be unreliable allies, their word worth less than the honor they claimed to hold so dear. But the Lannisters were different. Tywin Lannister understood the value of rewarding those who served him, and more importantly, he understood the necessity of punishing those who defied him. A thought began to form in Walder's mind, tentative at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. What if there was a way to not merely withdraw from the young wolf's cause, but to actively benefit from his downfall? What if House Frey could emerge from this war not as scorned supporters of a failed rebellion, but as heroes who had helped restore the king's peace? "Send a raven to Lord Tywin," Walder said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmur of discussion in the hall. "Tell him that House Frey remains loyal to the Iron Throne, and that we wish to discuss how we might be of service in bringing this rebellion to an end." Stevron's face paled. "Father, if we turn on the Starks, we'll be known as oath-breakers ourselves. Our word will be worthless throughout the realm." Walder looked at his son with something approaching pity. "The Starks broke faith with us first," he said, his voice patient, as if explaining something to a slow child. "We owe them nothing now. And as for our word being worthless," he gestured toward the windows and the river beyond. "What matters more in this world, boy? Honor, or that bridge and the power it represents?" He leaned back in his chair, feeling the ancient wood solid beneath him. The phrase had survived for centuries by being practical, by understanding that in the great game of power, sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. Other houses might have the luxury of choosing honor over advantage, but the phrase had only their wits and their bridge, and Walder would be damned if he let some love-struck boy king's broken promise destroy what generations of his family had built. The raven would fly south to Harrenhal, and Tywin Lannister would read its message with those cold, calculating eyes of his. And then, Walder thought, then they would see who understood the true nature of power in Westeros. The Starks could keep their honor. The phrase would take something far more valuable, survival, and the rewards that came from being on the winning side when the last battle was finally fought. Outside, the river flowed on, dark and deep, and utterly indifferent to the oaths of men. Chapter 4. Whispers from the South. The chamber at Harrenhal was cold, despite the braziers burning in each corner, their flames casting dancing shadows across walls that had been melted and twisted by dragonfire centuries ago. Tywin Lannister sat at a table of scarred oak, his hands folded before him, studying the map spread across its surface with the same intensity he brought to every task. The map was detailed, showing every river and road in the Riverlands, every castle and crossing, each one marked with small wooden pieces representing the various armies moving through the contested territory. The candlelight caught the silver in Tywin's hair and beard, both carefully trimmed and maintained despite the rigors of campaign. He was dressed simply for a lord of his stature, a red doublet of good wool with minimal ornamentation, practical boots worn smooth with use. Tywin had never been one for excessive display, understanding that true power needed no gilding. His presence alone, the set of his shoulders and the coldness of his green eyes, communicated more authority than any amount of jewelry or fine silk ever could. Outside the chamber, Harrenhal groaned and settled as it always did when the wind rose. The castle was a monument to hubris and its consequences, built too large by a house that had reached too far, then destroyed by dragons, and left as a reminder of what happened to those who forgot their place. Tywin found it fitting that he had made this ruin his seat of operations. There were lessons here for those wise enough to read them. A knock at the door interrupted his contemplation. "Enter," he said, not looking up from the map. Sir Kevan Lannister stepped into the chamber, Tywin's younger brother and most trusted adviser. Where Tywin was hard and cold as mountain stone, Kevan was softer in appearance, his face showing the weight and weariness of middle age. But his mind was sharp, and unlike so many others in their family, he could be counted on to speak truth rather than what he thought Tywin wanted to hear. "The raven from the twins has arrived," Kevan said, holding out a rolled message sealed with the Frey towers. "Walder Frey is more receptive to our overtures than I had dared hope." Tywin took the message, breaking the seal with practiced efficiency. His eyes moved across the words, with the speed of a man accustomed to processing large amounts of information quickly. As he read, the faintest hint of satisfaction touched his features, gone so quickly that someone who didn't know him well might have missed it entirely. "Lord Walder feels himself insulted by the young wolf's broken promise," Tywin said, setting the message aside. "He is willing to discuss how House Frey might better serve the Iron Throne." The old man didn't use those exact words, of course. Walder Frey was too canny to commit himself completely in writing, but the meaning was clear enough. Kevan moved to the table, studying the map with the same attention Tywin had been giving it. "The Freys control the crossing," he said unnecessarily, stating what they both already knew. "Without the twins, Stark's movements become severely limited. But simply denying him passage may not be enough. The boy has been winning battles through speed and surprise. If we just close the bridge, he'll find another way." Tywin nodded slowly, his mind already several steps ahead. "I'm not interested in merely inconveniencing Robb Stark," he said, his voice carrying that particular quality of absolute certainty that had made him one of the most feared men in Westeros. "I want to end him, and end this rebellion completely. The question is how to accomplish that, in a way that sends the proper message to anyone else who might consider taking up arms against the crown." The two brothers stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were contemplating hanging heavy in the air between them. Finally, Kevan spoke, his voice careful. "You're considering more than just withdrawing Frey support." It wasn't a question, and Tywin didn't treat it as one. "Robb Stark has made a critical error," he said, picking up a wooden piece representing the northern forces and turning it between his fingers. "He has insulted a valuable ally over a matter of sentiment. That insult gives us an opening, but only if we're prepared to exploit it fully." He set the piece down with deliberate precision. "The young wolf will need to cross back through the twins eventually. When he does, we need to ensure he doesn't cross back out." Kevan's face grew pale as he understood the full implication of his brother's words. "You mean to kill him under Walder Frey's roof, under guest right? The violation of such sacred hospitality. It would be seen as monstrous throughout the realm." "Yes," Tywin said simply, his tone suggesting he was discussing something no more significant than the price of grain. "It would be seen as monstrous." and that is precisely the point." He moved to stand directly beside the map, his finger tracing the path of the green fork. "For too long, the great houses have played at rebellion, as if it were a game, as if the consequences of failure were no worse than a temporary setback. They need to be reminded that there are lines which, once crossed, lead to utter destruction." He looked up at his brother, and Kevin saw in those green eyes a coldness that went beyond mere ruthlessness. This was calculation refined to its purest form, stripped of any consideration beyond the question of effectiveness. "But Walder Frey," Kevin said, "even if he agrees, he's a cautious man. He'll want guarantees, rewards substantial enough to justify the risk and the stain on his house's honor." "Then we give him what he wants," Tywin replied. "The Riverlands need a new Lord Paramount, now that the Tullys have proven themselves traitors to the crown. Walder Frey has coveted that position for decades. Promise it to him, along with whatever other assurances he requires. His sons can be wed to suitable houses, his grandsons given positions of authority. Whatever it takes." "And Roose Bolton?" Kevin asked. "We'll need northern cooperation if this is to work. The Freys can control the castle, but Bolton commands a significant portion of Stark's own army." Tywin had already considered this, had in fact been cultivating Bolton for weeks through carefully worded letters that offered possibilities without making explicit promises that could be traced back to him later. "Roose Bolton is a practical man," he said. "He understands that Robb Stark's cause is ultimately doomed, and he has no desire to go down with the young wolf's sinking ship. Offer him the north, make him warden, give him Winterfell, and the authority to bring the other northern houses to heel in the king's name." The enormity of what they were planning settled over the chamber like a physical weight. This wasn't just another battle or siege. It was the orchestration of betrayal on a scale that would echo through history. The complete destruction of the Northern Rebellion through the violation of one of the oldest and most sacred customs in Westeros, the protection of guests beneath one's roof. Kevin moved to one of the braziers, holding his hands out to its warmth, as if trying to drive away a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "This will destroy any hope of reconciliation with the North," he said quietly. "Even those lords who might eventually have been won over will turn against us forever. The Starks are loved in the North in a way that we in the South can barely comprehend." Tywin's expression didn't change. "The North can be brought to heel through fear, if not through love," he said. "And once Roose Bolton is installed as warden with a Lannister army at his back, the other houses will fall in line or be destroyed. As for reconciliation," he made a dismissive gesture, "I have no interest in being loved. I am interested in being obeyed, and in ensuring that this generation learns the cost of rebellion so thoroughly that the next generation doesn't dare attempt it." He returned to his chair, settling into it with the air of a man who had made his decision and saw no point in further debate. Kevin watched him, seeing in his brother's face the same expression he had worn decades ago when he had ordered the sack of King's Landing, when he had presented the bodies of Rhaegar's children to Robert Baratheon, wrapped in Lannister crimson. Tywin Lannister did not do things by half measures, did not shy away from brutality when he deemed it necessary, and he never, ever allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment. "Draft the letters," Tywin said, his tone indicating the discussion was concluded. To Walder Frey, offering him the Riverlands and whatever other inducements are necessary. To Rose Bolton, promising him the North and our full support in claiming it. Be subtle in the wording. We need to be able to deny our involvement if the messages are intercepted. But make sure both men understand exactly what we're offering and what we expect in return. Kevan nodded slowly, accepting the task even as part of him recoiled from it. And if either of them refuses, then we find another way, Tywin replied. But they won't refuse. Both of them are ambitious men who have been overlooked and undervalued by those they served. We're offering them the chance to rise higher than they ever could have hoped otherwise. They'll take it, because men like that always do. As Kevan left to begin drafting the treasonous correspondence, Tywin remained at his table, studying the map in the candlelight. Somewhere to the north, Robb Stark was celebrating his victories and his marriage, believing himself secure in his position as king in the north. He had no way of knowing that the trap was already being set, that his broken promise to Walder Frey had set in motion events that would lead to his destruction. Tywin felt no satisfaction in this, no pleasure or regret. It was simply necessary, another problem to be solved through the application of force and fear. The young wolf had proven himself a capable commander, but he was still just a boy playing at kingship, making decisions based on honor and emotion rather than cold calculation. And in the Game of Thrones, such weakness was inevitably fatal. The candles burned lower as night deepened over Harrenhal, and in the melted stone chamber, Tywin Lannister continued his planning, moving pieces on his map like a master strategist, playing out the end game of a contest whose outcome he had already determined. Chapter 5. The Seduction of Betrayal. The tent that served as Rose Bolton's quarters in the northern camp was spartanly furnished, containing little beyond a camp bed, a writing table, and a single chair. Unlike the other lords who travelled with their comforts, displaying their wealth and status through elaborate furnishings and personal effects, Rose preferred simplicity. It was partly practical, easier to move quickly when one wasn't burdened with unnecessary possessions, but it was also a matter of philosophy. Excess revealed weakness, a need for external validation that Rose had long ago concluded was beneath him. He sat at the writing table now, a single candle providing the only light in the dim interior. The flame cast his shadow large against the canvas wall, making him appear larger and more substantial than his slight frame warranted. In his hands he held a letter, the paper fine-quality parchment that had been sealed with red wax bearing the Lannister lion. He had read it 3 times already, but now he read it again, savoring each carefully chosen word. The letter was a masterpiece of careful ambiguity, offering much while committing to nothing that could be used as evidence of treason should it fall into the wrong hands. Tywin Lannister wrote of his admiration for those northern lords who understood the realities of power, who could see beyond immediate loyalties to longer-term advantages. He spoke of the instability of the current situation, of young kings who made decisions based on emotion rather than wisdom, and of opportunities that might arise for men wise enough to position themselves advantageously. But beneath the careful language, the message was clear. Tywin was offering Rose the North, Winterfell itself, and the position of Warden in exchange for helping to eliminate Robb Stark and bringing the Northern Rebellion to an end. It was an offer so audacious, so completely at odds with every oath Rose had sworn, that many men would have burned the letter immediately, and reported its sender as a traitor trying to corrupt them. Rose Bolton was not many men. He set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes unfocused, as he considered the situation from every angle. Rose had always prided himself on his ability to see things clearly, without the distorting lens of sentiment or honor that clouded other men's judgment. And when he looked at Robb Stark's rebellion with that clear vision, he saw a cause that was ultimately doomed despite its early successes. The young wolf was a capable commander. Rose would grant him that. His victories at the Whispering Wood and Oxcross had been impressive, displaying a tactical acumen that belied his youth. But capability on the battlefield was not the same as understanding the larger strategic picture, and in that regard, Robb Stark was hopelessly outmatched. The boy was fighting a war on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly superior resources, and he was doing so while alienating potential allies through decisions driven by personal feeling rather than political necessity. The marriage to Jane Westerling was a perfect example. Rose had been present when Robb had announced his decision to his commanders, had seen the carefully controlled reactions of men who understood immediately what a catastrophic mistake their king was making. The Freys were not a house anyone particularly liked, but they controlled a crucial strategic position, and Robb's broken oath had transformed them from grudging allies into certain enemies. More than that, it had revealed a fundamental weakness in the young wolf's character. He was his father's son, bound by notions of honor and personal integrity that had no place in the reality of Westerosi politics. Ned Stark's adherence to honor had gotten his head separated from his shoulders, and Robb seemed determined to follow the same path, choosing personal happiness over strategic advantage and expecting the world to respect him for it. Rose had no such illusions. He had grown up in the shadow of Winterfell, his house ancient but forever secondary to the Starks who ruled the north from their castle of grey stone. The Boltons had been kings once, before the Starks had conquered them and forced them to kneel. That history was long past, reduced to tales told by old men and symbols like the flayed man that adorned his banners. But Rose had never forgotten it. His family had bent the knee for centuries, serving the Starks loyally, because they had no choice. But loyalty born of necessity was not the same as loyalty born of love. A sound outside the tent drew his attention. Footsteps approaching, heavy and confident. Rose recognized the tread before the tent flap was pulled aside, and his bastard son, Ramsay, stepped into the candlelight. Ramsay Snow was everything Roose was not, loud where his father was quiet, cruel where his father was coldly efficient, driven by appetites and impulses that Roose found distasteful but occasionally useful. The young man's face was flushed, whether from exertion or excitement, Rose couldn't immediately tell, and his eyes held that wild quality they often did when he was anticipating violence. "The men are positioned as you ordered," Ramsay said, his voice carrying an eagerness that made Rose's jaw tighten fractionally. "They'll be ready to move when the time comes, and they know to keep their mouths shut about it." Rose studied his son for a long moment, weighing the risks of involving him in this. Ramsay was useful in certain situations. His capacity for brutality and his lack of moral constraints made him an effective tool when properly directed. But he was also unpredictable, driven by impulses that Rose didn't fully understand and couldn't always control. Still, he would need allies he could trust absolutely when the moment came. And blood, even bastard blood, created bonds that were harder to break than mere oaths. "Sit," Rose said, gesturing to the camp bed. "We need to discuss what comes next, and you need to understand the importance of patience and timing in what we're planning." Ramsay sat, his body thrumming with barely contained energy. His hands flexed and clenched, a nervous habit that Rose found irritating, but didn't comment on. The boy, and Rose still thought of him as a boy despite his years, had inherited his father's pale eyes, but none of his self-control. "The young wolf has made enemies of the phrase," Rose said, his voice soft and measured. "That creates opportunities for those wise enough to see them. Lord Tywin has made me an offer, one that would see House Bolton elevated beyond anything we could hope to achieve by following Robb Stark to his inevitable defeat." He watched Ramsay's reaction carefully, seeing the understanding dawn in those pale eyes, followed quickly by excitement. "You're going to betray him," Ramsay said, and there was a hunger in his voice that made Rose wonder, not for the first time, if his son took too much pleasure in such things. "I am going to ensure our house's survival and prosperity," Rose corrected. "Betrayal implies breaking faith with someone to whom we owe genuine loyalty. The Starks have ruled the North for thousands of years, but that doesn't mean they deserve to rule it forever. They've grown soft, clinging to notions of honor that have no place in the world as it actually exists." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "We will help Lord Tywin end this rebellion, and in return, we will be given what the Boltons lost centuries ago. The North will be ours." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Winterfell, ancient seat of House Stark, would become Bolton property. The other northern houses, the Umbers and Karstarks, the Manderleys and Mormonts, all would bend the knee to a new Warden of the North. It was an opportunity so vast that Rose himself, with all his careful planning and cold calculation, could barely grasp its full magnitude. "When?" Ramsay asked, and Roose appreciated the directness of the question, even if he found his son's transparent eagerness distasteful. "When the time is right," Rose replied. "Lord Walder is coordinating with Lord Tywin, and when everything is in place, we'll receive word. Until then, we continue as we have been, loyal commanders serving our king, without question." He fixed Ramsay with a look that communicated more threat than any words could. "That means you give no sign, no hint of what's coming. You take no actions that might alert anyone to our plans. Do you understand?" Ramsay nodded, though Rose could see the effort it cost him to accept such restrictions. "Good," Rose said, returning his attention to the letter on his desk. "Now leave me. I have much to consider and arrangements to make." After Ramsay had gone, Rose sat alone in the candlelight, feeling the weight of what he was planning settle more fully onto his shoulders. He had no illusions about what others would think of his actions. The word traitor would follow his name through history, and songs would likely be written about the treacherous Lord Bolton who betrayed his king. But Rose had never cared much for songs or the opinions of others. History was written by victors, and he intended very much to be on the winning side when this war finally ended. He thought of Robb Stark, young and confident and doomed, riding through the camp outside this tent with his direwolf at his side, believing himself secure in the loyalty of his bannermen. The boy had no idea that the trap was already closing around him, that the very men he trusted were preparing his destruction. There was something almost sad about it, but Roose pushed that thought aside. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when the future of his house hung in the balance. The candle burned lower, its wax pooling on the writing table, and Roose Bolton continued his planning, his pale eyes reflecting the flame as he contemplated the death of kings and the birth of a new order in the north. Chapter 6. The Young Wolf's Final March. The northern host moved through the riverlands, like a great serpent winding its way across the landscape. Banners streaming in the autumn wind, the sound of thousands of marching feet creating a rhythm that seemed to shake the very earth. From his position near the front of the column, Robb could look back and see the army stretching behind him, a river of men and horses and wagons that disappeared into the distance. The sight filled him with a pride he tried to temper with caution, remembering his mother's constant warnings about the dangers of overconfidence. Grey Wynn loped alongside his horse, occasionally ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents, before circling back, the dire wolf's presence a constant comfort. The great beast had grown even larger in recent months, his shoulders now reaching past Robb's waist when he stood on his hind legs. Men gave the wolf a wide berth when they passed, and Robb had noticed that even hardened veterans who had faced Lannister steel without flinching would edge away when Grey Wind turned his amber eyes in their direction. The weather had turned cold in the past week, autumn asserting itself with frost that silvered the grass each morning, and a wind that carried the promise of winter on its breath. Robb pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders, feeling the thick wool and the fur lining that his mother had insisted he bring. Catelyn rode a short distance behind him, accompanied by her guards, her face set in that expression of quiet worry that had become her constant companion since they had left River Run. Beside Robb rode the great Jon Umber, his massive frame making even his warhorse look small by comparison. The great Jon was in high spirits, as he often was when the army was moving, singing bawdy songs in a voice that carried far down the column, and occasionally punctuating his verses with booming laughter that startled the horses. It was impossible not to be affected by his energy, and Robb found himself smiling despite the weight of command that pressed constantly on his shoulders. "Your Grace," the great Jon bellowed, breaking off his latest song mid-verse. "When we've finished with the Lannisters and sent them scurrying back to their rock, what say you we march on King's Landing itself? I'll wager my best sword we could have Joffrey's head on a pike within a fortnight." Robb's smile faded as he considered the question. The great Jon meant well, but he sometimes seemed to think warfare was simply a matter of enthusiasm and sharp steel, without considering the complexities of supply lines and political alliances. Taking King's Landing would require a siege of a city that had never fallen to assault, or waiting them out while his own army consumed the countryside around them, making enemies of the very people they claimed to be protecting. "One step at a time, my lord," Robb replied, keeping his tone light to avoid dampening the great Jon's mood. "First, we need to secure the Riverlands completely, and that means dealing with the Freys." The mention of the Freys caused a shadow to pass over the great Jon's face. "Ah, yes, "The weasels of the crossing," he muttered, his earlier cheer evaporating. "Begging your pardon, your grace, but I still say you should have let me ride to the twins and teach old Walder some manners when he started making noises about your marriage." Robb had heard this argument before, multiple times, from the Great John and others. Lord Umber seemed to believe that most problems could be solved through the application of sufficient force and volume. What the Great John doesn't understand, Robb thought, is that we need the Freys more than they need us, at least for now. The crossing at the Twins was essential if they were to move their forces efficiently, and antagonizing Walder Frey further would only make an already difficult situation worse. "We'll make our peace with Lord Walder," Robb said with more confidence than he felt. "I've offered fair terms, marriages that will bind our houses together. He'll see reason once his wounded pride has had time to heal." Even as he spoke the words, Robb wondered if he truly believed them. The letter he had received from Walder Frey in response to his proposals had been brief and cold, accepting the suggestion that Edmure Tully would marry one of the Frey daughters, but making it clear that this was an inadequate substitute for the royal match that had been promised. Still, Walder had agreed to host the wedding at the Twins, which suggested he was at least willing to maintain some form of alliance. The column continued its march as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning frost and warming the air enough that men began shedding their outer layers. They passed through villages where people watched from doorways and windows, their faces showing that mixture of hope and fear that had become common throughout the war-torn riverlands. Some cheered as the northern banners passed, calling out blessings on the young wolf and his cause. Others simply watched in silence, probably hoping that the army would pass through quickly without demanding too much in the way of supplies or causing too much disruption. As midday approached, Robb called a halt near a stream, where the army could water their horses and rest before continuing. He dismounted, feeling the stiffness in his legs from hours in the saddle, and led his horse to the water. Grey Wind immediately plunged into the stream, lapping noisily and sending ripples across the surface. "Your Grace," a familiar voice called, and Robb turned to see Jane approaching, accompanied by her mother, Lady Cybele. His wife wore a riding dress of deep blue wool, practical for travel, but well cut enough to show her figure. Her dark hair was plaited in a single braid that hung down her back, and her face was flushed from the exercise of riding, making her look even more beautiful than usual. Robb's heart lifted at the sight of her, as it always did. Whatever doubts he had about the political wisdom of their marriage evaporated when she was near. He had made the right choice, he told himself. Love was rare enough in this world of arranged marriages and political alliances. How could it be wrong to choose it when it was offered? "How are you holding up?" he asked, taking her hand and drawing her close. "The pace has been hard these past few days," Jane smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "I'm well enough," she said, "though I'll admit I'm looking forward to sleeping in a real bed again, rather than a tent." She glanced around at the bustling camp, where men were spreading out along the stream bank and settling down to eat whatever provisions they carried. "Your army is impressive, Robb. I had no idea it would be so large. This is only part of it," Robb said with a touch of pride he couldn't quite suppress. Lord Bolton commands another large force to the north, and we have garrisons holding various strategic positions throughout the Riverlands. When we gather everything together, we'll have close to 40,000 men." The number sounded impressive when he said it aloud, and indeed it was a formidable force by any standard. But Robb knew that Tywin Lannister could field armies even larger, and the Tyrells, who had allied themselves with the Lannisters through Margaery's marriage to Joffrey, added tens of thousands more to the enemy's strength. Numbers alone wouldn't win this war. They needed strategy and timing, and, if he was being honest with himself, a considerable amount of luck. Lady Sybil approached, her expression as carefully neutral as always. Robb had never quite warmed to Jane's mother, sensing in her a calculating quality that reminded him uncomfortably of Cersei Lannister, though he immediately felt guilty for the comparison. Lady Sybil had been nothing but respectful and supportive since his marriage to her daughter, and he had no reason to mistrust her beyond a vague unease he couldn't quite articulate. "Your Grace," Lady Sybil said, inclining her head, "might I have a word in private?" Robb glanced at Jane, who nodded encouragingly, then followed Lady Sybil a short distance from the stream, where they could speak without being overheard. She turned to face him, her hands folded before her, and for a moment said nothing, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I wanted to thank you again for the honor you've shown my house," she said finally. "Wedding Jane, despite the political complications it created. Not many men would have chosen as you did." There was something in her tone that Robb couldn't quite read, a quality that might have been approval, or might have been something else entirely. "I love your daughter," he said simply. "That's reason enough," Lady Sybil smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Your Grace. Love is a precious thing. I only hope that in the days ahead you'll remember that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones made for the people we love." Before Robb could ask what she meant by that cryptic statement, she had turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone with a growing sense of unease. He shook off the feeling, attributing it to the general tension of the campaign and his own awareness of the difficult negotiations that awaited them at the Twins. The army continued its march as the afternoon wore on, covering miles of countryside that showed the scars of war everywhere they looked. Burned villages, trampled fields, abandoned farmsteads where families had fled before advancing armies. This was what rebellion looked like, Robb thought. Not the glory and honor that songs celebrated, but the slow, grinding destruction of ordinary people's lives. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, a scout came galloping back from the van of the column, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Your Grace," he called, pulling his mount to a halt in front of Robb. "The Twins are in sight, perhaps 2 hours ahead at our current pace." Robb felt his stomach tighten. The moment he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure had finally arrived. "We'll make camp for the night," he decided. "I want the men rested before we arrive. Tomorrow we'll approach the Twins properly, with full honors." As the order was passed down the column, and men began the familiar routine of making camp, Robb stood looking north toward where the Twins waited, invisible beyond the rolling hills, but present in his mind with perfect clarity. 2 identical castles joined by a bridge, controlling the crossing that was essential to his plans. And within those walls, Lord Walder Frey waited, Nursing his wounded pride and weighing his options, Robb reached down to touch Grey Wind's massive head, drawing comfort from the wolf's solid presence. "Everything will be fine," he told himself. "Walder Frey is pragmatic above all else. He'll accept our terms because the alternative is to be left out entirely when we win this war." But as twilight deepened into night and fires began to blossom throughout the camp, Robb couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was missing something, that there was a piece of the puzzle he hadn't seen, or a danger he hadn't anticipated. He pushed the thought aside, attributing it to pre-negotiation nerves, and went to join his wife for the evening meal. Tomorrow they would reach the twins, and tomorrow they would begin the process of rebuilding the alliance that his marriage had fractured. It would work out. It had to work out, because the alternative was too costly to contemplate. Chapter 7. The feast begins. The great hall of the twins smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, scents that should have been welcoming, but somehow felt cloying in the enclosed space. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting a warm glow that reflected off the polished surfaces of serving platters and the faces of the assembled guests. Long tables had been arranged to accommodate the northern lords and their retinues, while Lord Walder Frey sat at the high table, his ancient frame propped up by cushions, his watery eyes surveying the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to read. Robb entered the hall with Jane on his arm, both of them dressed in their finest clothing for this crucial occasion. His doublet was deep grey wool embroidered with the Stark direwolf in silver thread, while Jane wore a gown of cream silk that her mother had insisted was appropriate for meeting with Lord Frey. Around them, the northern lords filed in with varying degrees of enthusiasm, the Great John already eyeing the barrels of wine with obvious interest, while Lord Karstark maintained his perpetual scowl, still bitter about his son's deaths, and seemingly determined to find fault with everything. Grey Wind had not been allowed into the hall. The direwolf had growled and resisted when Robb tried to leave him outside, pressing against his legs with unusual insistence. But the guards at the door had been firm, and Robb had reluctantly ordered the wolf kennelled for the duration of the feast. Now, walking through the hall without Grey Wind's comforting presence, Robb felt oddly exposed, though he couldn't articulate why. "Welcome, welcome," Lord Walder called from his high seat, his voice thin and reedy with age, but carrying clearly through the hall. "The young wolf honors us with his presence, and his lovely bride as well. Come, sit, partake of our hospitality." There was something in the old man's tone that made Robb pause, a quality that might have been mockery, or might simply have been Walder's natural manner of speaking. He approached the high table and bowed, the gesture respectful, but not subservient, remembering that he was a king, even if this castle belonged to another. "Lord Walder, thank you for receiving us," Robb said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy his mother had drilled into him. "I hope this feast can mark a new beginning for our houses and strengthen the bonds between us." "Bonds? Yes," Walder replied, something that might have been a smile touching his lips. "Bonds are important, aren't they? Oaths and promises, the things that hold civilization together." He gestured to the seats that had been prepared. "Sit, eat, drink. We have much to celebrate, don't we? A wedding, after all, though perhaps not the one we expected." Robb felt his jaw tighten at the barb, but forced himself to remain calm. He took his seat beside Jane, accepting a cup of wine from a serving girl who kept her eyes downcast. Around them, the other lords were finding their places, the hall filling with the sounds of benches scraping across stone, and men calling greetings to one another. The food began arriving almost immediately, carried by an army of servants who wove between the tables with practiced efficiency. There were roasted pigs with apples in their mouths, haunches of venison swimming in rich gravy, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, wheels of cheese from the Frey dairy, and countless other dishes that demonstrated the wealth Lord Walder had accumulated over his long life. Wine flowed freely, the great John already on his second cup, and calling loudly for a third. Robb tried to eat, but his appetite had deserted him. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong, though he couldn't identify what exactly was troubling him. The other Freys present, Lord Walder's seemingly endless progeny of sons and grandsons, were smiling and making conversation, but their expressions seemed forced, theatrical, in a way that set his nerves on edge. Beside him, Jane ate delicately, her face showing the strain of the past weeks of travel and the tension of this meeting. Lady Sybil sat on her other side, picking at her food and occasionally whispering something to her daughter. Catelyn was seated further down the high table, and when Robb caught her eye, he saw his own unease reflected in her face. Musicians had been positioned in a gallery above the hall, and now they began to play, the melody unfamiliar to Robb, but pleasant enough. Some of the younger Freys and northern lords began calling for their ladies to dance, and soon the floor space between the tables was filled with couples moving through the formal steps of courtly dances. "More wine," Lord Walder called, raising his own cup with a hand that trembled slightly. "To the king in the north, and to his bride, and to all the promises we make and break in this life." The toast was accepted with varying degrees of enthusiasm, many of the Northmen clearly uncertain how to interpret Walder's words. Robb drank, the wine sour on his tongue, and tried to catch his mother's attention again. But Catelyn was looking elsewhere, her face suddenly pale, her hand gripping the edge of the table. The musicians had changed their tune, the melody shifting into something slower and more ominous. Robb recognized it after a moment. The Rains of Castamere, the Lannister song about the destruction of House Rain. Why would they be playing that here, at a feast meant to celebrate a Tully wedding? He started to stand, some instinct screaming danger, but before he could rise fully, he felt a sharp pain in his side. Looking down in confusion, he saw blood spreading across his grey doublet, dark and wet in the torchlight. A Frey man-at-arms stood behind him, blade still extended, his face showing no emotion at all. The hall erupted into chaos. Crossbow bolts began flying from the gallery where the musicians had been, cutting down northern lords where they sat. Men were shouting, some trying to draw their swords, others simply screaming as they realized what was happening. The great John roared and overturned the table in front of him, using it as a shield, but Robb could see at least 3 arrows protruding from his massive frame. Robb tried to reach for his own sword, but his side was on fire, and his legs wouldn't support him properly. He fell to his knees, blood pooling beneath him, his vision starting to blur at the edges. Through the confusion of fighting men and fleeing servants, he saw Jane, her face frozen in horror, her hands reaching toward him. Then she jerked once, twice, and blood blossomed across the front of her cream-coloured gown. She fell, her eyes wide with shock and pain, and Robb tried to crawl toward her, but his body wouldn't obey him anymore. "Mother!" he tried to call, but the word came out as barely a whisper. Through the chaos he could see Catelyn, held by 2 Frey soldiers, her face a mask of anguish as she watched her son dying. She was screaming something, but the sounds of battle and death drowned out her words. More of his men were falling now, the Freys and Bolton soldiers. He could see the flayed man banners now had turned on their supposed allies. It was a massacre, not a battle. His lords and knights cut down where they sat, many of them drunk, and none of them armed for combat. The breach of guest right was so complete, so unthinkable, that even now part of Robb's mind refused to accept what was happening. Lord Walder appeared above him, his ancient face looking down without pity or remorse. "The king in the north," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "Not so kingly now, are you, boy?" Robb tried to speak, to curse him or plead, or simply ask why. But blood was filling his mouth, and his vision was darkening. His last coherent thought was of grey wind, probably already dead in whatever kennel they had trapped him in, and of Winterfell, home that he would never see again. The dire wolf and the castle blurred together in his fading consciousness, and then there was nothing but darkness and the distant sound of his mother screaming. Chapter 8. The Broken Guest Right. The morning after the red wedding dawned grey and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. In the great hall of the twins, servants moved silently through the carnage, their faces carefully blank as they worked to clean the blood from the stone floors. The bodies had been dragged out during the night, northern lords and common soldiers alike, piled unceremoniously in the castle yard like so much refuse. The smell of death lingered despite the servants' efforts, mixing with the sour odor of spilled wine and the metallic tang of blood that seemed to have soaked into the very stones. Lord Walder Frey sat in his high seat, the same position he had occupied during the feast, though now the hall was nearly empty save for a handful of his sons and grandsons. His ancient face showed no remorse, no second thoughts about what had been done in his castle under his roof. If anything, he looked satisfied, a man who had successfully concluded a difficult but necessary piece of business. Rose Bolton stood near one of the tall windows, looking out at the green fork flowing past below. His face was as impassive as always, revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those pale eyes. He had changed his clothing since the previous night, the blood-spattered garments replaced with clean wool and leather, but his hands still bore traces of red beneath the fingernails that no amount of washing seemed able to remove entirely. The raven to Tywin Lannister had been sent at first light, carrying news of the rebellion's end and requesting the rewards that had been promised. Another raven had flown to King's Landing, informing King Joffrey that his enemies in the north had been eliminated, and that loyal servants of the crown awaited his royal favor. The messages were carefully worded, emphasizing loyalty and service while glossing over the methods that had been employed to achieve the desired result. But even as these official communications winged their way south, other ravens were flying as well, carrying very different messages. Survivors from the massacre had escaped into the night, stumbling through the darkness to reach friendly castles, where they could spread word of what had happened at the twins. and with each telling, the horror of the event grew more vivid, the violation more unthinkable. At River Run, Lord Edmure Tully received the news from a blooded soldier who had somehow made it through the Frey lines. The man's account was disjointed, broken by sobs and the trauma of what he had witnessed. But the essential facts were clear enough. His nephew Robb was dead, murdered at a wedding feast, along with his wife and most of his commanders. The Northern army had been decapitated in a single night through treachery, so complete that it defied comprehension. Edmure's first reaction was disbelief. Such things didn't happen, couldn't happen. Guest right was sacred, one of the oldest and most inviolable customs in all of Westeros. A host who offered bread and salt to a guest was bound by the most solemn obligation to protect that guest, and the guest in turn was obligated to do no harm while under the host's roof. To break guest right was to commit an act so fundamentally abhorrent that it struck at the very foundation of civilized society. But as more survivors trickled in over the following days, each bringing their own testimony of the massacre, denial became impossible. The Red Wedding, as it was already being called, had happened. The Freys and Boltons had conspired with the Lannisters to murder Robb Stark and his followers while they were guests under Walder Frey's roof during a feast ostensibly held to celebrate a wedding alliance. The news spread across the Seven Kingdoms like wildfire, carried by ravens and riders and merchants travelling the roads. In every castle and keep, lords and ladies gathered to hear the latest reports, their faces showing varying mixtures of shock, horror, and calculation as they tried to understand what this meant for the realm and for their own positions. In the north, the reaction was primal and immediate. When word reached Winterfell, now held by Rose Bolton's bastard son, Ramsay, the castle's inhabitants reacted with a grief and rage that seemed to shake the very walls. The small folk in Wintertown gathered in the streets, weeping openly for their murdered king. Some called for immediate retaliation, for armies to march south and burn the twins to the ground with all the Freys inside. Others simply mourned, understanding that such vengeance was beyond their power now that the northern host had been destroyed. Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbour, upon hearing the news, was said to have wept until he could weep no more, then locked himself in his chambers for 3 days. When he emerged, his face was set in lines of hatred, so deep they seemed carved from stone. He swore by the old gods and the new that the Freys and Boltons would pay for their treachery, that he would see justice done, even if it took the rest of his life. The mountain clans, those fierce warriors who lived in the high places of the north and owed allegiance to no one but the Starks, sharpened their weapons and prepared for war. They cared nothing for the politics that had led to the Red Wedding, understanding only that the young wolf, who had treated them with respect and honor, had been murdered through treachery. Blood demanded blood, and they would have it. But even as the North raged and grieved, the practical realities of their situation became increasingly clear. Their king was dead, their army scattered or destroyed, their strongest lords either killed at the twins or compromised by their association with the Boltons. Rose Bolton, backed by Lannister gold and soldiers, was declaring himself Warden of the North, and there were few who had the strength to oppose him. In the Vale, Lady Lisa Arryn heard the news with barely concealed satisfaction, her lips curving in a smile that her son found disturbing. The affairs of the realm beyond her borders had always seemed distant to her, relevant only insofar as they might threaten her own security. That Robb Stark was dead meant one less king making claims and demands, one less complication in a world she found increasingly difficult to navigate. On Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon received word of the Red Wedding with cold fury, not because he had any particular love for Robb Stark, whom he had considered a rebel and traitor to the rightful king, but because the method of Stark's death offended his rigid sense of justice and honor. To murder a man at a wedding feast under guest right was an abomination that no political consideration could justify. He made a note that when he took the Iron Throne, as he fully intended to do, the Freys and Boltons would answer for their crimes. In King's Landing, the reaction was more complex. King Joffrey was delighted by the news, clapping his hands and demanding that Robb Stark's head be brought to him so he could display it on the walls beside his father's. His mother Cersei shared his satisfaction, though with more restraint, seeing in the Red Wedding the removal of a serious threat to Lannister power. But others in the capital were less certain that the long-term consequences would be so favorable. Tyrion Lannister, upon hearing the details of what had been done, felt a disgust that he couldn't entirely hide. His father had orchestrated this, he knew, had planned and executed the destruction of the Northern Rebellion through methods that would stain the Lannister name for generations. Yes, it was effective. Yes, it had eliminated an enemy who might otherwise have proven impossible to defeat in the field. But at what cost to their house's reputation? The violation of guest right reverberated through the realm in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. If such sacred customs could be broken by great lords acting with the crown's blessing, what other protections could be trusted? When a merchant traveled to a castle to conduct business, could he be certain he would leave alive? When lords gathered for councils, could they trust that they wouldn't be murdered for political convenience? The social fabric that held Westeros together, already frayed by years of war, was developing tears that might never fully heal. Trust, once broken on such a fundamental level, could not be easily restored. And while Tywin Lannister might consider this an acceptable price for ending the Northern Rebellion, others throughout the realm were beginning to calculate their own positions with a new and disturbing clarity. If the Freys and Boltons could betray their oaths and face no consequences beyond enrichment and elevation, what did that say about the value of loyalty? If the crown would reward such treachery, what message did that send to every ambitious lord in the Seven Kingdoms? The old rules, the customs and traditions that had governed behavior for thousands of years suddenly seemed negotiable in ways they never had before. At the Twins, Lord Walder Frey sat in his hall and convinced himself that history would vindicate his choice. He had backed the winning side, had helped eliminate a rebellion that might have torn the realm apart. Yes, the methods were harsh, but war was harsh, and sometimes difficult choices had to be made for the greater good. But even as he told himself this, even as he counted the rewards that Tywin Lannister had promised, he couldn't help noticing how his servants looked at him now, the fear and disgust in their eyes when they thought he wasn't watching. And late at night, alone in his chambers, he sometimes wondered if the price of his victory might prove higher than he had calculated. The realm would remember the Red Wedding. That much was certain. But what lessons it would draw from that memory, and what consequences would ultimately follow, remained to be seen. Chapter 9. From ashes and blood winter came to the north, with a fury that seemed to mirror the rage of its people, snow falling in great sheets that buried roads and villages beneath drifts taller than a man. In Winterfell's great hall, Roose Bolton sat in the seat that had belonged to the Starks for thousands of years, his pale eyes surveying the assembled northern lords with the same cold calculation he brought to everything. The ancient castle felt wrong around him, as though the very stones rejected his presence. But Rose paid no attention to such fanciful notions. Stone was stone, power was power, and sentiment had no place in either. The banner hanging behind the high seat was no longer the grey direwolf of House Stark, but the flayed man of House Bolton. The gruesome sigil, a reminder to all who looked upon it of the price of defiance. Some of the northern lords who had been summoned to bend the knee kept their eyes carefully averted from that banner, unable or unwilling to look directly at the symbol of their new master. Others stared at it with barely concealed hatred, their hands clenching into fists that they had no means to use. Lord Wyman Manderley stood among those gathered, his considerable bulk seeming somehow diminished by grief and rage. He had come to Winterfell because he had no choice, because refusing the summons would have meant war that White Harbour could not win, not with Lannister gold backing Bolton forces and the Northern army destroyed at the Twins. But the look in his eyes when they met Rose's spoke of debts unpaid and vengeance deferred, not of genuine submission. "My lords," Rose said, his soft voice somehow carrying through the hall despite its lack of volume. "We gather here to begin the work of healing. The North has suffered through rebellion and war, has seen its sons die in foreign lands for a cause that was always doomed to fail. Now it falls to us to rebuild, to restore order and prosperity under the rightful authority of the Iron Throne." The words were pretty enough, carefully chosen to sound reasonable and conciliatory, but everyone in the hall understood the truth beneath them. This was not about healing, but about consolidation, about forcing the northern houses to accept Bolton rule through a combination of promises and threats. Those who bent the knee would be allowed to keep their lands and titles. Those who refused would be made examples of, their houses destroyed as completely as the Starks had been destroyed at the Red Wedding. One by one, the lords came forward to swear their oaths, the words tasting like ash in their mouths. Some spoke the traditional phrases of fealty, with their heads held high, maintaining what dignity they could in defeat. Others mumbled through the words with eyes downcast, unable to meet Rose's gaze as they pledged loyalty to the man who had betrayed their king. And a very few, refused entirely, walking out of the hall, knowing that they were likely signing their own death warrants, but unable to stomach the alternative. In the south, at Harrenfall, Tywin Lannister received reports of the northern situation with satisfaction. The elimination of Robb Stark had been accomplished with remarkable efficiency, and the installation of Bolton as Warden of the North was proceeding according to plan. Yes, there was resistance, pockets of loyalty to the old order that would need to be dealt with, but resistance without leadership was merely inconvenience rather than genuine threat. The backbone of the Northern Rebellion had been broken at the Twins, and what remained were scattered forces without coordination or realistic hope of victory. But even as Tywin calculated the success of his strategy, there were consequences he hadn't fully anticipated, ripples spreading from the Red Wedding that would eventually lap at the foundations of Lannister power. The stain of the broken guest rite could not be easily washed away, and throughout the realm, lords and ladies who might have eventually made peace with Lannister rule now held back, unwilling to trust a regime that would sanction such treachery. More immediately troubling were the surviving Stark children, scattered to the winds, but not, as Tywin had hoped, entirely eliminated. Sansa remained in King's Landing, a useful hostage, but also a potential rallying point for Northern loyalists if she were ever freed. Arya had disappeared entirely, vanished somewhere during the chaos of war, her fate unknown. Bran and Rickon were supposedly dead, killed when Theon Greyjoy had taken Winterfell, but there were persistent rumors that the boys had escaped and might still be alive somewhere beyond the Wall or in hiding among loyal northern houses. And then there was Jon Snow, the bastard son who had taken the Black, and should therefore have been irrelevant to the Game of Thrones. But Jon carried Stark blood, however tainted by illegitimacy, and men in desperate circumstances had been known to rally around far less legitimate claimants. Tywin made a note to keep watch on developments at the Wall to ensure that the bastard remained where he was and didn't get ideas above his station. At Winterfell, Rose's bastard son Ramsay was proving to be both an asset and a liability. The young man's capacity for cruelty was useful in keeping the small folk cowed and demonstrating the consequences of defiance, but his excesses were beginning to trouble even his father. There were reports of flayed men displayed on the walls, of hunting parties where the quarry was human, of screams echoing from the dungeons at all hours. Such brutality might serve a purpose in the short term, but Rose understood that fear alone could not sustain rule indefinitely. Eventually, people pushed too far would push back, regardless of the consequences. In the ruins of the northern host, survivors gathered in secret places to tell stories of the Red Wedding, and to keep alive the memory of their murdered king. The young wolf became legend even as his body cooled in the ground, his victories embellished, and his mistakes forgiven or forgotten. Songs were written, crude verses sung in taverns and around campfires, celebrating Robb Stark's bravery and cursing the treachery of the Freys and Boltons. The more the new regime tried to suppress these songs, the more widely they spread, taking on lives of their own and transforming defeat into martyrdom. The Brotherhood without banners, a group of former soldiers and dispossessed small folk who refused to accept the war's outcome, began operating in the Riverlands, striking at Frey and Lannister targets whenever opportunity presented itself. They were too scattered and poorly equipped to pose a military threat, but their very existence was a reminder that the Northern cause had not been entirely extinguished, that resistance continued even if organized rebellion had been crushed across the narrow sea in the free cities where news of Westeros arrived weeks late and often distorted. Word of the Red Wedding caused its own ripples. Daenerys Targaryen, the last known survivor of the dynasty that had ruled the Seven Kingdoms for 3 centuries before Robert's rebellion, heard of Robb Stark's death with a mixture of emotions. He had been a usurper from her perspective, one more king trying to steal what rightfully belonged to her family. But the manner of his death troubled her. Whatever his crimes, he had deserved better than to be murdered at a wedding feast by men who had pledged him loyalty. The months following the Red Wedding saw the Lannister grip on the Seven Kingdoms tighten in some ways and weaken in others. On the surface, their victory seemed complete, the Northern Rebellion crushed, the Riverlands pacified, and their enemies scattered or dead. But beneath that surface, resentments festered, and plans for vengeance were carefully nurtured. The Manderleys continued to plot in White Harbor, maintaining the appearance of submission, while secretly reaching out to other houses who shared their hatred of the Boltons. The mountain clans refused to come down from their heights, rejecting all summons and killing any Bolton men who ventured too far into their territory. And in the Vale, though Lady Lisa remained determinedly neutral, there were those among her bannermen who looked north and wondered if opportunity might not present itself to reclaim territories that had once belonged to houses with Vale connections. The chaos in the north created a vacuum that various factions sought to fill, each pursuing their own interests, while the official narrative of peace and reconciliation continued to be proclaimed from castles and keeps. Tywin Lannister lived long enough to see the immediate fruits of his strategy. The Northern Rebellion ended, and Lannister power seemingly unassailable. But he would not live to see the long-term consequences, the ways in which the Red Wedding's stain would spread and corrupt, undermining the very stability he had sought to create. The breaking of guest right had established a precedent that others would eventually follow, a demonstration that no custom was sacred when power and advantage were at stake. In the great Game of Thrones, the Red Wedding would be remembered as a masterstroke of strategic thinking, a brilliant and brutal solution to a seemingly intractable military problem. But it would also be remembered as something else, as a moment when the old rules that had governed Westerosi society for thousands of years were revealed to be conditional, subject to cancellation when convenient. And once that revelation had been made, once everyone understood that no oath was truly binding, and no custom genuinely sacred, the realm would never be quite the same again. The North remembered, as the Stark words had always promised. And what it remembered was not just the young wolf's victories or his mistakes, but the manner of his death and the debts that death had created, debts that would someday, somehow, be paid in full measure and with interest. Chapter 10. The Legend of the Young Wolf. In the years that followed the Red Wedding, the story of Robb Stark transformed in ways that those who had known him might not have recognized. What had been history, raw and recent and painful, gradually became something else, polished smooth by countless retellings, until the sharp edges of truth were worn away, and what remained was legend. In taverns throughout the north, old men who claimed to have marched with the young wolf would tell tales over cups of ale, their voices growing louder and their gestures more expansive as the evening wore on, and the drink flowed more freely. The boy king, who had made both brilliant strategic decisions and catastrophic personal mistakes, became, in these tellings, a hero of almost mythic proportions. His victories at the Whispering Wood and Oxcross grew more spectacular with each retelling. the numbers of enemies defeated multiplying, while the complications and costs were quietly forgotten. The dire wolf Grey Wind became larger and more fearsome in memory than he had been in life, described as a beast the size of a horse, with eyes that glowed red in the darkness, and jaws that could bite a man in half. In Wintertown, where the shadow of Winterfell's walls fell across the streets each evening, mothers would tell their children stories of the young wolf as they tucked them into their beds. These stories bore little resemblance to the historical record, such as it was, but they served a different purpose than mere accuracy. They were about honor and courage, about a king who had refused to compromise his principles, even when doing so might have saved his life. The broken oath to the Freys was reframed in these tellings, transformed from a politically disastrous decision into a romantic choice that demonstrated the depth of Robb's love for his queen. Jane Westerling herself became a tragic heroine in these stories, beautiful and doomed, her death at the Red Wedding described in terms that would have made the poets of the Age of Heroes proud. The fact that she had come from a minor house of little importance was forgotten, replaced by tales of her beauty and grace that supposedly drew Robb's attention despite his duty to others. In some versions of the story, she was even given prophetic dreams, warnings of the doom that awaited at the twins that she tried desperately to communicate, but which went unheeded. The songs about the Red Wedding spread across Westeros with a speed that troubled those in power. The most popular of these, a ballad called "The Night They Murdered the King," was officially banned by royal decree, but that only seemed to increase its appeal. It was sung in secret gatherings and hummed in market squares, the melody simple enough that even those with no musical training could carry it. The lyrics were crude but effective, telling the story of betrayal and murder in language that anyone could understand, painting Walder Frey and Roose Bolton as villains of such pure evil that they seemed almost supernatural in their malevolence. In the citadel at Old Town, where the maesters kept their records and trained the next generation of scholars, the Red Wedding was being analyzed and documented with rather more care for accuracy. Maester Yandel, who had been commissioned to write a comprehensive history of the War of the Five Kings, spent months gathering accounts from survivors and witnesses, trying to piece together what had actually happened in the Great Hall of the Twins on that terrible night. His research revealed a picture that was more complex and troubling than the simple narrative of good versus evil that had taken hold in popular imagination. Yes, the violation of guest right was monstrous, but it had been committed by men with understandable motives, men who saw themselves as pragmatists choosing survival over sentiment. The Freys had been genuinely insulted by Robb's broken oath, and from their perspective, the young king had proven himself untrustworthy, making their betrayal a response to his own faithlessness rather than an unprovoked atrocity. Roose Bolton's motivations were even more rational when examined from a certain angle. He had recognized that Robb's cause was doomed despite its early successes, had calculated that the North would suffer less under a northern warden who made peace with the crown than under continued war that could only end in defeat. That his calculations also elevated his own house to unprecedented power was, from his perspective, merely a fortunate coincidence that aligned personal interest with regional benefit. But Maester Yandel's careful analysis and measured conclusions would never reach as many people as the crude songs and simplified stories that portrayed the Red Wedding as an act of pure evil. History, he reflected as he wrote his account, was not merely what happened, but what people chose to remember. And they chose to remember stories that confirmed their existing beliefs about honor, loyalty, and the nature of justice. In the North itself, the memory of the Red Wedding served purposes that went beyond mere commemoration. It became a rallying point for those who refused to accept Bolton rule, a grievance so profound that it justified any action taken in pursuit of vengeance. When houses gathered in secret to discuss rebellion, they would begin by invoking the names of those who had died at the Twins, reciting them like a litany of the fallen that bound the living to action. The young wolf's memory became a weapon in itself, more powerful dead than he might have been alive, because death had transformed him from a fallible young man into a symbol that could mean whatever his supporters needed it to mean. The Meisters debated, as they debated everything, whether the Red Wedding had ultimately strengthened or weakened the realm. Some argued that by ending the Northern Rebellion decisively, it had prevented years of continued bloodshed and ultimately saved lives. Others countered that the violation of guest right had damaged the social fabric so severely that the realm might never fully recover, that trust once broken on such a fundamental level could not be restored in a single generation, or even several. Both perspectives had merit, and both missed something essential. The Red Wedding had revealed a truth about power that had always existed, but which most preferred not to acknowledge, that the customs and traditions that supposedly governed behavior among the great houses were ultimately optional, subject to being set aside when advantage demanded it. This revelation changed how lords and ladies approached negotiations and alliances, made them more cautious and more cynical, less willing to trust in oaths, and more reliant on hostages and concrete guarantees. In the wider world beyond Westeros, where the intricacies of northern politics meant little, the Red Wedding became a cautionary tale about the dangers of divided kingdoms and the brutality of civil war. Merchants in Volantis and Pentos would reference it when discussing the importance of stable government, using Robb Stark's fate as an example of what happened when legitimate authority broke down and power became the only law that mattered. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred in how the North thought of itself. Before the Red Wedding, Northern identity had been built around pride in their ancient heritage and their reputation for honor and straightforward dealing. After the Red Wedding, that identity acquired a darker edge, a sense of themselves as victims of southern treachery who could trust only each other. The phrase, "the North remembers," took on new weight, becoming not just a statement of fact about their long memories, but a promise of eventual vengeance years later, when winter finally came in earnest, and threats from beyond the wall demanded attention that might otherwise have been devoted to old grievances. The memory of the Red Wedding would still color northern attitudes toward the rest of the realm. The young wolf's ghost haunted not just the Twins where he died, but the entire North, a reminder of what had been lost and what debts remained unpaid. And in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the songs and the stories and the scholarly analyses, those who had actually known Robb Stark would remember him as he had been, rather than as legend had transformed him. They remembered a boy thrust into kingship before he was ready, trying desperately to live up to his father's legacy while navigating political complexities he didn't fully understand. They remembered his mistakes as well as his virtues, his youth and inexperience, alongside his courage and honor. But even these more balanced memories were fading as those who had known him died or grew old, their clear recollections replaced by the hazier second-hand accounts of those who knew only the stories. In time, perhaps a generation or two, the historical robber Stark would be lost entirely, swallowed by the legend of the young wolf who had loved too well and trusted too much, who had died for his honor, and became immortal in his defeat. The Red Wedding would be remembered, as the Starks had promised. But what was remembered would be as much invention as history, shaped by the needs and beliefs of those doing the remembering, rather than by simple fidelity to fact. And perhaps that was fitting, for in a world where oaths could be broken and guests murdered in their hosts' halls, what was one more transformation of truth into myth?